In the financial district of New York, a luxurious plaza rises among the towering glass skyscrapers. Everyone who enters is in awe of the modern artworks on the ceiling and the state-of-the-art digital screens. This is not an ordinary office building. This is the headquarters of Harlan & Company. Harlan & Company was a respected tech giant operating in the fields of artificial intelligence, big data, and defense technologies. Their developed facial recognition systems, voice-activated home technologies, and even military algorithms had caught the attention of the Pentagon. The company was a showcase of success, where young and ambitious entrepreneurs shined and luxury cars lined up at the entrance. But no one remembered the true architect of this massive structure, or they pretended not to. Every morning at 8:30 a.m., an elderly man wearing a gray fedora would appear in front of the building. His gray coat had faded a little in the sunlight, and the old leather-bound album he held in his hands was worn out. Sometimes he would enter the lobby, sit in one of the chairs, and stare at the photos in the album for a long time. The photos, engineers he had worked with, young interns, and his treacherous partners. No one knew his name. They would simply say, "Who's that old guy anyway?" One of the young employees once laughed and said, "Maybe he's someone who's testing our hologram systems. Ha. If this story has drawn you in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now sit back in your chair, because this story will take your breath away." But no one saw the fire in his eyes. No one knew that the words co-founder Richard Harlan on the wall at the company's entrance were actually a lie. Because that name was a dream taken from the past of Mr. Milton Asher, the true founder. When Milton Asher was betrayed by his partner, he was 62 years old. And that day he lost everything. But he never gave up. He was thought to be lost. The media went silent. But Milton, in a small workshop far away, reinvented himself. For years he invested, turned to different fields, and quietly built his empire. And years later, he became the silent partner of 3 major companies within the Harlan & Company building. Today, he closed the album in his hands, adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and for the first time, he walked into the building. No one noticed, but at that moment, it was the beginning of a story that would change everyone's fate. When Mr. Milton Asher stepped into the building, no one inside recognized who he was. Yet years ago, at the groundbreaking ceremony of this building, he had driven the first nail in with his own hand. Back then, his name was revered, not only in the tech world, but across the entire business community. But no one knew how he had been ousted from the company he founded. A partnership, a few forged signatures, and a midnight email had taken all his inheritance from him. 25 years ago, Milton met a young investor just a few years before his retirement, Richard Harlan. He was smart, charismatic, but ambitious. Milton believed in him. He treated him like his own son. In fact, he transferred 49% of the company's shares to him. But Richard had different intentions. He planned to take Milton's ideas, designs, and years of hard work, then push him aside. And he succeeded. One day, Milton's computer froze. When he arrived at the office, his room had been emptied. He wasn't allowed in. The security guard remained silent as he looked at him. Richard didn't answer his calls. Within the same week, the company's name was changed. Former employees signed new contracts, and everyone preferred to stay silent, because staying loyal to an old man meant risking their careers. Milton had been kicked out, not only from the company, but from the very door of his life. That day, Milton's house was mortgaged. Letters from the banks piled up. His wife couldn't handle it and had a heart attack. His daughter stopped speaking to him after everything that happened. He suddenly found himself alone and poor. But do you know what he did? He stayed silent, but he never forgot. Every morning in the park he walked through, he began sketching new projects in his notebook. He repaired his old laptop with parts he bought from a junkyard. He connected with young people learning software through YouTube via email. He built a website from the internet. He didn't use his name, but he let his intelligence speak for itself. In 1 year, an artificial intelligence project succeeded. In 2 years, investors lined up wanting to buy it. But he always kept his name hidden, because his goal wasn't to make money. One day it was to return to that building. Milton walked through the same park every morning. His shoulders were a bit slumped, his steps slow, but his eyes still sparkled. He held an old notebook in his hands, its pages filled with ideas, plans, and dreams accumulated over the years. Each one was a line distilled from a lifetime. There, in that notebook, were the silent screams of an old man that had been held inside for years, now finding space in small sentences. A section of the notebook stood out, the comeback plan. This wasn't a revenge he had quietly woven, but a search for justice. He formed a small team with the young people he met online. He never told them who he was. He only shared his ideas. The young people never questioned his age. His knowledge, experience, and foresight had impressed them. They called him Mr. M. No one had seen his face. Together, they developed an AI-powered health monitoring system for the elderly. Milton's mantra was, "One day, everyone will grow old, and technology is not just for the young." The system he had built caught the attention of major health companies. An investor deal was made, but Milton didn't attend any meetings. A young member of his team represented him. He was still that old man in his small house, brewing his own coffee, walking through the streets like an ordinary person. But at night, sitting at his desk, he made decisions far bigger than any CEO would. He was now a millionaire, and no one knew. He founded his own investment company. The name was simple but meaningful: Silver Fox Ventures. It was the nickname his daughter had given him when he was a child. Through this company, he began buying up Harlan and Company's suppliers, software infrastructure, and logistics partners one by one. Richard Harlan, without even realizing it, was growing more and more dependent on the very person who held the lifeblood of his company. Things were starting to fall apart inside. Deliveries were delayed, customer complaints were increasing, and the software systems began to crash. Richard was furious. He yelled in meetings, blaming everyone, but no one understood what was really happening. Because the enemy wasn't outside the door, it was inside the veins, and everything had come from Milton's pen. One day, a young intern approached Richard after a meeting. "Wasn't the man who founded this company Milton Asher?" he said. "What a visionary he was. I read one of his old articles, and it's still relevant today." Richard frowned and replied mockingly, "That old man? He's a thing of the past. This world belongs to the young now." That same night, the intern, curious, opened Silver Fox Ventures' website. While browsing the executive team section, one line caught his attention: Founder, M.A. A suspicion formed in his mind, but he didn't tell anyone. This couldn't be just a coincidence. During those days, Milton was still walking in the same park, a cane in one hand, a notebook in the other. He was sitting on the bench playing chess. No one knew his username in the app: Mr. M. Just like years ago, he was in the middle of a strategy game. But this time, the pawns were people. The chessboard, the real world. Everything was ready. But Milton didn't rush. He set a day for his return. It was the day when Richard would have his biggest meeting with investors. The night before, Milton looked at old photographs. The eager young man he once was, the dreams he had built with his wife, the moments when his daughter laughed in his arms. A voice inside told him, "Let it go. You're getting old. Forget about it." But another voice was stronger. "They never forgave you. You only represent justice." And now here he was, standing in front of that building. It seemed like an ordinary day, but it wasn't. In his coat pocket, he held the keys to the company. He opened the door and entered. As he took slow steps, no one even looked at him. He still appeared as a simple old man. But at that moment, everyone inside had already had their fate written, because sometimes the quietest steps leave the loudest echoes, and sometimes karma simply waits. The right day, the right man. Milton still appeared to be the same old, slightly hunched, somewhat forgotten man on the outside. But inside, things were quietly, methodically, and almost mathematically falling into place. Every day, he would walk to the small library behind the park, where he regularly rented a few books each week: economics, psychology, corporate communications, digital security. It seemed like a normal habit, but the librarian had noticed him taking notes, sometimes staring at certain pages for a long time. No one could have guessed that Milton was analyzing the psychological weaknesses of Harlan and Company. His goal wasn't to create destruction. Instead, he was carefully watching how a decaying structure managed to stand, planning to take it down from its very core without anyone realizing. Milton was not alone. From a distance, he was being aided by 3 experts, each in their own field. A hacker, a young programmer who had once helped him with a university scholarship, an interior designer, the daughter of the company's former vice president and a researcher, an advocate for justice who had quietly gathered evidence during Milton's lost lawsuit. They began secretly observing the company's employees. Who was truly honest? Who was just in love with their seat? Who had turned their back on Milton in the past without anyone noticing? They built profiles on each of them. Harlan and Company from the outside still seemed like a prestigious firm, but on the inside, cracks were starting to show. One morning, Richard's personal assistant noticed that all the appointments in the system had suddenly disappeared. Then, an investor presentation file was mistakenly posted on the company's social media accounts. These small details led to significant image damage. Everyone was looking for the culprit, but no one could find them. Because the attacks weren't coming from the inside, nor from the outside, they were being constructed from above. On the same day, a new consultant was recommended to the company, a productivity enhancement consultant sent by Silver Fox Ventures. A young man quietly observing behind his glasses, chatting with employees but never intervening. He was, in fact, Milton's eyes. Every sentence spoken in the office, every shared file, every mistake made was being turned into a report. Richard, while talking to an old friend about the chaos, said, "It feels like everything is coming down at once. The energy of the company is off." His friend simply nodded. Sometimes the universe just watches. Then when the time comes, it turns. Milton continued his daily walks in the park. One day he held a black and white photo. It was of the old building, taken in his youth, wearing a suit, looking proudly at the camera. A young man passing by looked over and said, "Nice photo." Milton just smiled. The young man didn't know who he was, but a few years later that photo would appear in a documentary, and it would be narrated as, "That was the moment he returned." A rumor began to spread among the employees in the office. Who is the new investor? Who is sabotaging the systems? Why does everything seem fine, but something feels off? The most curious part was the new consultant's comments. One day during lunch, he said, "Sometimes some people quietly observe, because the right time begins with learning not to speak at the wrong time." No one quite understood what he meant, but that sentence echoed throughout the company like a whisper bouncing off the walls. Milton still wasn't speaking. He still wore his old suit, took notes in his notebook, sipped his coffee. But now he had reached the last pages of his notebook. And on that page, there was only one sentence: "Reckoning is born from silence." Milton placed his pen down after writing that sentence. His hands trembled slightly. Every emotion he had suppressed for years was hidden behind that small phrase. Because this story wasn't just about being fired. It was the silent scream of a man whose pride, family, and life had been shattered into pieces. 25 years ago, Milton wasn't just a successful manager. He was also a father of 3, an honorable husband. Throughout his life, he had never strayed from honesty, always teaching his children, the price of everything you earn should be paid with the sweat of your labor. But neither his sweat nor his integrity could prevent the false accusations that echoed through the company's corridors that day. After being fired, everything fell apart like a domino effect. First, his social circle began to unravel. Neighbors, friends, and even people he had shared countless meals with over the years. Everyone started to distance themselves slowly. It was as if he had committed a crime, and no one wanted to get involved. Then the silence began at home. His wife, Margaret, initially tried to stay strong, but as the credit debts piled up and Milton could no longer meet the needs of the household, slowly the expression on her face began to change. One day, his young son, Liam, came home from school and said, "My friends say you're a thief. Dad, are you a bad person?" That sentence tore Milton's heart in two. He had lost not only his job, but also his place in his son's eyes. One of his 2 daughters had to drop out of university. The other moved to another state to work. The family was still together, but they were disconnected. At night, everyone retreated to their own rooms, and it felt like nothing in the house was shared anymore. Only Margaret still occasionally placed her hand on Milton's back, silently staying by his side, but even she was gradually fading away. Milton would sometimes go out at night, walking to the old building. He could only look at the door he used to swipe his card to enter. One night, he stood there for hours under the rain. He crumpled a letter he had pulled out of his jacket pocket. The letter had been written the day he was fired. It bore Richard's signature and one short sentence. "It has been concluded that you have damaged the company's reputation. Your employment here is terminated." There was no judgment, no right to defense. Just a sentence. Over time, Milton sank into silence. But within that silence, something grew. Patience, like a fire burning inside, like an unquenchable truth. The old books he had collected for his home, the diagrams he had drawn, the notes he had written, all of them were for the day that door would open again. But this time, not as a guest, he would return as the owner. One morning, as Margaret came down to the kitchen, she found Milton drinking tea by the window. She hadn't seen him smile like that in a long time. She approached and placed her hand on his shoulder. "When will this silence end?" Milton turned and for the first time in 20 years, looked into his wife's eyes with hope. "Soon, very soon, Margaret. But first I will thank them for teaching me patience." That patience was Milton's weapon. During the years when his family had fallen apart, when it shrank and faded, he had never acted out of revenge. But he believed there was a path to justice, and now he was right on that path. That old life had been a collapse, but this new life that was being rebuilt, it wasn't revenge born from silence. It was earned. After years of silence, Milton now moved with deliberate purpose, watching from the shadows without ever being seen. The new owners, consultants, investors of the company, he knew their weaknesses, saw their vulnerabilities like a chess master anticipating every move. His wisdom had been shaped by the patience of time. Others, however, were still blinded by the pursuit of money. He secretly established an investment fund. He didn't even put his own name on it. He became almost invisible, deliberately staying out of the spotlight. He invested in small companies, growing through them, expanding his influence. And then one day, with no alarms, no flashy moves, just a few signatures and the right connections, the fund quietly acquired 51% of the shares in his former company. No one noticed, but he still waited, because for him, the issue wasn't just ownership. For him, the issue was being seen. As he waited, Richard still walked the halls of the building like the boss, unperturbed by the years that had passed. Not once had he thought of Milton. In fact, one day in the hallway, someone mentioned, "I heard a story about a man who was unfairly fired years ago," and Richard shrugged it off. When has that ever happened here? It was that very sentence that turned Milton's silent fire into a storm, because his desire wasn't to be remembered. His sole wish was to leave a mark that would never be forgotten. The next morning, he walked into the building, wearing his long brown coat silently. In his hand was an old file he had carried for years. Inside, there were no threats, no complaints, just the truth. The documents no one ever expected. The company's internal corruption, data hidden for years, and the small workers Richard had sold out to fill his own pockets. He approached the security guard, not even lifting his eyes. "My name is Milton. I need to get inside." The security guard hesitated at first, then called someone on the phone. But when he saw the document in Milton's hand, he said nothing and opened the door. Some truths, after all, aren't just read, they're felt. As Milton made his way down the hall, the office began to stir. The old-timers were shocked. The newcomers didn't even know who he was. But everyone, without exception, knew that the man who had just entered that morning was no ordinary person. He walked steadily up to the upper floor. He stopped in front of Richard's office. Without knocking, he slowly opened the door. The room fell silent, and when Richard looked up and their eyes met, everything he had buried years ago hit him all at once. That brown jacket, those silent eyes, that quiet storm coming step by step. Milton smiled faintly. "Good morning, Richard. I'm here for a long overdue conversation." For a moment, Richard's face showed confusion. Then a smug smile appeared. I don't recognize you. Who are you? Milton stepped inside. Slowly, he pulled a folded photo out of his jacket pocket. The photo was worn, but it held an indelible memory. Richard glanced at it out of the corner of his eye, and his face turned as pale as chalk. The photo showed a moment from years ago. A small table, a cup of tea, and beside it, a young Milton, a woman with sparkling eyes and a little child in her arms. I'm the remains of a life you never cared about, Richard. The air in the room thickened. The secretary opened her mouth to say something, but Milton raised his hand to silence her. This will be a private conversation. Richard leaned back with an angry grin. What do you want? Money? An apology? Milton's voice echoed, as if from a deep, resonating place within him. I bring the pain of the day you made me unable to buy a carton of milk for my child, sitting at your luxury desk. I am the memory of the night I first saw fear in my wife's eyes as she looked at me. When you fired me, you didn't just destroy an employee, you destroyed a man. Richard's words caught in his throat, as if the very air refused to let him speak. Milton pressed on. You told me, you don't have a job anymore. But that day, something else started inside me. I watched you in silence. I watched your actions, your lies, the shoulders you climbed over to rise. And on many of those shoulders, there were faces like mine. Milton placed a file on the desk. It was heavy, like a gun loaded with truth. What's inside isn't just your truth. It's the truth of everyone you've silenced for years. I'd love to give it to the press, but it would hurt much more this way. Richard sprang to his feet. Who do you think you are, threatening me? This is my company. Milton shook his head slowly. Not anymore. And from his pocket, he pulled out a document, a notarized piece of paper, a purchase approval. The 51% stake in the company was now owned by the MCS Trust Fund, Milton Charles Stanton's foundation. Richard trembled. This can't be. Milton locked eyes with him. It's possible, Richard, because I stayed silent, worked, waited, while you talked, crushed, and forgot. Suddenly, the door swung open. The board members, legal advisors, and the new CEO candidate entered. Milton stepped back, just watching. The new CEO turned to Richard. Richard, your association with this company ends today. You'll need to vacate your office with security. Richard screamed in panic. This is ridiculous. I built everything. This company grew because of my work. Milton looked at him one last time. No, Richard, this company grew from our ruins, and now you will carry that rubble. As Richard was escorted out by security, he paused for a moment. He looked back at Milton. His eyes were filled with tears, but those tears weren't of regret. They were tears of loss. Milton stood still in the same place, wearing the same coat. His face held neither arrogance nor anger, only quiet peace. Justice doesn't come with noise. It's born from silence. And when it arrives, everyone falls silent. Milton took a deep breath, as if finally releasing the weight of the years inside him. He slowly pulled out an old crumpled notebook from his pocket. Its edges were frayed. The pages had yellowed with time, but the words inside whispered the pain, the silence, and the unwavering hope of a lifetime. He opened the notebook, his trembling hands turning the pages. He stopped and held one page up. This is the last note my son wrote to me. One day, everything will get better, Dad, because you're still smiling. That day, he couldn't pay his son's school fees, and his child had been taken out of school. That day, his wife quietly cried in her room, trying to hide it from him. And that day, Milton lost not just his job, but a life. But now, that lost life had opened a new door. He turned back to the room and gazed out the window. Below, in front of the company, stood hundreds of employees. Faces that had been crushed, neglected, ignored for years. Among them was a woman, his wife Margaret, whose eyes still sparkled with hope despite her white hair. And beside her, a young man, their son, Elliot. Milton smiled. He opened the door, stepping out with heavy but determined strides. A murmur rose from the crowd. Just a few seconds later, that murmur turned into applause. For the first time, his name was being spoken with respect. He wasn't just a man, he was a man who waited, who never forgot and never forgave. Meanwhile, Richard was being escorted out the back door of the building, his head lowered, his once arrogant eyes now empty, filled with the deep void of years wasted. Milton paused for a moment. He looked up to the sky. This wasn't revenge, he whispered to himself. This was divine justice, waiting for the right moment. And in that moment, something shifted within everyone. Some regretted the silence they had kept for so long. Some believed in justice once again, and some swore never to look down on anyone ever again. Because some stories aren't just told, they are felt. And this was one of those stories. That day, the hundreds of people gathered in front of the building witnessed not just the changing of a company, but the silent fulfillment of justice that had been ignored for years. Milton had never acted out of anger. What had brought him here was not a desire for revenge, but the quiet yet most powerful form of justice: patience. For years, he had been a man no one asked about. But while he stayed silent, he spoke with his heart. Every step, every moment of giving up, every time he got back up after falling, those invisible stones had brought him to this moment. And now everyone was hearing the voice of their own conscience in his silence. When Milton gathered with the employees, he spoke just one sentence. No one should judge another by their appearance, age, or wealth, because sometimes the greatest strength is hidden within the one who seems the most fragile. Those words pierced the hearts of everyone present. People felt ashamed, because the old man they once mocked and ignored was now reshaping their bread, their justice, and their hopes. As Milton left the building, he looked up at the sky. He smiled. No matter how ruthless life may seem, in the end, everything finds its place. Because karma never forgets. Whatever you made someone feel, one day it would find you with the same emotion. And when that day comes, what matters is not how much you gained, but what you left in the hearts. This story was not just Milton's. It was the story of the silent ones, the overlooked ones, everyone who was wronged. And one day you too will either be the reason for justice in someone else's life or the cause of their regret. The choice is always yours. Thanks for watching. If you liked our new story, please like, share, and tap the bell to hear new stories told every day.